just an introduction for Danny. Danny Dorling has joined the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford in September 2013 to take up the Helford Mackinder Professorship in Geography. He was previously a professor of geography at the University of Sheffield, and he also worked in Newcastle, Leeds, New Zealand, and, drumroll, Bristol. Much of Danny's work is available open access on his website. I found it really interesting to navigate around it over the past couple of days. And with a group of colleagues, he previously helped create a website called worldmapper.org, which shows who has most and least in the world. And his work concerns issues of housing, health, employment, education, wealth, and poverty. We're here to talk about his recent book, Peak Injustice. It follows on his previous best-selling book, Peak Inequality, which I think I also saw on the table over there from 2018, offering a carefully curated selection of Danny Dorling's latest published writing with brand new content looking at the future, including challenges for the new government in 24-25, the impact of Jeremy Corbyn's legacy, and the implications of Keir Starmer's many blind spots. Thank you, Danny, for being here today. Big question. Are we really at peak injustice?
Thank you. It's a question that worries me in that I wonder if what I'm doing is wishful thinking. I began as an academic in Newcastle looking at computer visualization, drawing maps, different ways of looking at a census. I just happened to compare changes over time. This was in the 1980s, early 1990s, and things were getting worse. I came here and I learned how to write books here in Bristol with some wonderful colleagues from different departments. We used to come and write books in the pub. David Gordon, Mary Shaw, George David Smith. We wrote one called The Widening Gap, and this is late 90s, about the changes that were happening. And then I spent the rest of my academic life writing books about the situation getting worse in various ways, which was very tricky under New Labour because there was an ethos that everything is getting better, things can only get better in 1997. I campaigned in Bristol West. If you remember, William Waldegrave went from first to third, or Labour came from third to first. It was a time where you thought there was huge hope and huge change. But in hindsight, we didn't get that transformation in society that we thought we were getting. And then come 2010, you suddenly have austerity being imposed upon people year after year after year, causing more deaths than a COVID pandemic. There are a few people who dispute that now. I published Peak Inequality in 2018 because we'd just beaten, or almost beaten, Bulgaria to become the most unequal country in Europe. We overtook Portugal in 2009 to become the most unequal in Western Europe. It's telling me to shut up. It's quite good. And there are statistical signs. So all the pay deals since 2019 that I know of have been progressive, even within the Murdoch newspapers. Over a certain salary, you haven't had the same pay rise as people on a lower salary. That hasn't happened, that shift, since 1918, not for 100 years. It's only been a few years so far of this, but it's begun. The reason I call this Peak Injustice is that I get a sense in the last couple of years that nobody is any longer defending inequality. You no longer get a single person saying, this is good for productivity, there's trickle down of wealth, it's tough, but you do get a few people saying, don't worry, there's growth on the horizon, but I really get a sense of sentiment changing, sort of sadness, anger, the cost of living crisis, which means everything still costs 30% more than it did 2.5 years ago. And hence, it's a shock when Marcus Rashford comes out, first of all, and campaigns and get children fed in the holidays. And that was a battle. But you've got to carry on doing that every holiday now, every Christmas, every summer holiday, and people are much worse off than they were 2 years ago. So it is there in some of the statistics on income and on wealth, but I think it's really there in the sentiment of we did something, an experiment in this country, not seen anywhere else in Europe. Nowhere else in Europe went from being so relatively equal in the 60s and 70s. Of large European countries, only Sweden was more equal than we were in terms of income. Nowhere else went from that to this incredible set of gaps between us, and then kept inequality so high, like high blood pressure. And we did that from the late 90s through to now. And we've shown what happens. You don't get an incredibly productive country where talent and money creates amazing new things. You get discord, you get Brexit, you get anger, you get race riots in the summer. You have people living in fear of what might happen to their children, including the very, very well-off, spending an enormous amount of money, more money than the well-off spend anywhere else in Europe, trying to insulate their children from the risks of society and being afraid of what's going to happen. So it's partly wishful thinking. It could get worse. It's not impossible. But when you are the most unequal country in Europe, at the most unequal you have been since the 1930s, when you do have levels of hunger rising as we have now, which are not disputed, when you have children getting shorter, which we now realise has occurred in England since about 2010, we can't find this elsewhere in Europe, and it's not because we're letting short immigrants in. Right? It really isn't. Then I think you have an overall sense. The really good news is that these trends in countries change very slowly. The last time we were at a peak of inequality was 1918. We taxed the rich to pay for the First World War. There were lots of battles, but half of the equality we gained from 1918 to the most equal we became was gained by 1939. It wasn't the 1945 government. The battles were in the 20s and the 30s. Nobody was happy. Nobody went, these are brilliant decades, general strike, mass unemployment. So I'm not saying it's going to be wonderful in the next few years, but when it changes, when you get a shift, once you get those first progressive pay deals, once you say the higher paid school teachers are going to have a smaller percentage increase than the lower paid school teachers, once trade unions actually agree to that, rather than saying everybody is going to have 4% or 3%, it's quite hard to argue 1 year, oh, let's stop doing that then. Let's widen the gaps. So I am optimistic. I don't think we're going to become like the United States of America. I don't think we're going to fall apart completely and become a kind of Blade Runner society. That had been the direction in which we had been going for about 4 decades. And it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the well-off, as well as people at the bottom of society who are absolutely desperate. John Burr-Murdoch in the FT, Stephanie Flanders, Bloomberg, BBC economics correspondent, last year both explained that the poorest fifth of people in the UK are now poorer than the poorest fifth in most of Eastern Europe. And it's the realization of what that actually means that has sunk home and is no longer disputed publicly by anybody. And I think it's just worth holding some hope that we're not getting people telling us this is okay.
Yeah, just to pick up on the fact that you just mentioned around children getting shorter, because I was just reading some reports recently around ultra-processed food, which are the cheaper food. items in a store, and they are a cause for that kind of children getting shorter. And there's evidence in terms of the UK's consumption of ultra processed food, and it having everything to do with poverty and income. But in talking about children, I think I also want to talk about women and about gender, because when we talk about child poverty, it's about women's poverty, and we have a gender pay gap in the UK. And you mention in your book like households with families and the poverty level, but in many instances those will be single parent households that have just the woman is head of the household in that family. I was talking recently to Torsten Bell, who's MP for Swansea, and he's an economist, and he was talking about his economics perspective about us never having had more women in employment previously. Like, this is the most women we have in employment, and it's great. Well, yes, it is great, but at the same time, a lot of them are in unsafe jobs, lowest paid jobs, jobs in care, lowest paid jobs in the economy. For young women, it's apprenticeship type jobs that pay below minimum wage, and you do touch on some of the apprenticeship roles in your book. But where does gender sit when we talk about peak injustice from your point of view?
This is where I'm weakest. Of the many criticisms you can have of what I do, I don't do enough on gender. And our statistics are disaggregated, so you can do it. Child poverty is the most obvious one, in that it is almost always a woman who is the head of a household, of a lone parent household. It's amazing how quickly men who find themselves looking after children discover a woman who will come and help him. It's very lucky, but it means there are relatively few poor single male fathers. Is it Torsten Bell, when he was funding the Resolution Foundation, interestingly, was the person who popularised the 56% of children with a brother and a sister, 56% of children with two siblings, occasionally more, are going hungry 3 or 4 times a month, seriously hungry. And I think it's interesting that it's Torsten who has said that, and we have to restore benefits for the 3rd child in the family and the 4th child, which we took away. And Torsten was parachuted into Swansea, and he's now sitting there in the government, which currently isn't doing this. There's this difference between Queen Anne's Gate, West London, where the Resolution Foundation is based, and Prospect Magazine, and fascination with the salaries of people, and the fact that the salaries of some women have gone over men, particularly if they're in London, and what's happening in somewhere like Swansea. So if you mix gender and geography, you can begin to see the differences and where it starts. Somerset, not far from here, is one of our poorest counties, lowest paid. It's people working in care in old age people's homes, largely women, who are largely the lowest paid. Or the other sector, you think we've got a minimum wage, but it doesn't apply if you're an apprentice. Think about nursery nurses. Who are our nursery nurses? And why are those women so young in the nurseries? And the reason they're so young is that you can pay them something like £4.70 or £5 an hour, as long as you call them an apprentice, right? And so we have various ways in which particular jobs are assigned, caring jobs, more than any else, are assigned to women, and devious ways of actually getting around legislation to pay women less. And as you get these absolute increases in people, it's beyond deprivation now. The actual increase in hunger, in people going cold, in people being unable to replace basic items in their houses, like a kettle, unable to have house insurance, which may not sound like very much, but if you have no money and you don't have insurance and you have a flood, that is the end, if you like, of a particular life as far as you and your children are concerned. Unable to save £10 a month. This is mainly households led by women. unable to ever spend anything on yourself. And all these things are measured by government and all have been rising. But it is where I feel least comfortable able to write about it, because I'm an extremely affluent man. So trying to look through the shoes of others and think, what is it like? What I can do is look at studies, and particularly the studies of people putting things back on supermarket shelves, or actually before they go to the checkout. That's women. People going to food banks who've got children, it's women. Men won't go to the food bank, right? So it's women who have to go to the food bank and do it. And it's when you get into the starkness of the actual actions, it begins to affect you more. I can tell you that 1 in 3 children are in poverty, but you're kind of impervious to that by now, or what it means. And it's slightly shock horror, and you don't want to do it. But if I tell you, in my city of Oxford, it was 2 years ago when we first got the reports of the first babies who'd never been washed in warm water. Because with the fuel crisis, if you're cut off and don't have any gas, and you can't heat up water on the stove, or it's too much effort, and then it's upsetting. You sort of think, and babies don't get used to being washed in cold water, and it's much harder to clean a baby with cold water. And who is doing the cleaning, and who is worrying about it? So a lot of this, there is a lot of things which are angry and quite depressing in the book, but in a way, to get to a position where it's likely to change, it turns out, sadly, we have to get to this point. And then there are all these new MPs in all the poorest constituencies in Britain. Without exception, the poorest constituencies are all represented by Labour. And a lot of them will be discovering this because their constituents will tell them that. As long as Torsten goes to Swansea at least every second Friday. And that's all I ask. I don't mean me, but he'd learn as much as he learned in the Resolution Foundation, simply by holding his surgeries in Swansea.
Yeah, I know one of the most striking graphs in your book that I couldn't stop looking at is the one about child mortality for children under 5, and the kind of significant drop of the UK from being in the top in just the early 2000s, and then dropping to the bottom of the list in Europe by the late 2018 to 2019.
Well, there's about 5 countries, neonatal mortality. So I do numbers. This is what I do numbers, and it's very impersonal when you can talk about something that's awful, which is a child death, but you talk about it impersonally. I used to work in the geography department up on the hill just above Park Street. If you came out of the back of the geography department and just wandered along, you got to the garden at the back of the children's hospital. It's one of the saddest places because it's where the parents are. So I'm not immune to, but neonatal mortality. Of only 5 countries in Europe which were higher than us, and I always get in trouble when I say this. One of them is Romania, but we are on course at the moment to cross over, and that's very good news. Amazingly good news from Romania and child poverty. And it isn't that there's some rightful place where the UK should always be doing better than Romania, but the fact that we are at that point, and this was during when the health secretary was Jeremy Hunt, who supposedly cared about stillbirths and so on. I got very angry with Jeremy Hunt. The other statistic in the book on this, or trying to turn stories into statistics and back again. Do you remember the baby who died last January, where it was a Sun newspaper headline, and then all the newspapers ran the headline of him. He died next to the body of his father, who had a heart attack, and he died from lack of water and food. And social workers tried to get in, couldn't get into the house. Nobody's quite sure. There's baby Bronson. And this was a heart-wrenching story, and it hit the papers for a bit. And I can remember thinking, way back in the 90s, when Jennifer's Ear, if you're old enough, Jennifer's Ear was a major story. So we've gone from a child with glue ear, or whatever it was, not being treated, to death of a baby. And then the thing that got me was, once it became clear that this baby had died in Skegness, it was less of an issue. Now, based in Bristol, it is the Child Mortality Monitoring Service that tries to record all the deaths of children. And in the last 4 years, the number of children aged 1 to 4 dying has increased. Nothing to do with the pandemic at all. In fact, the pandemic helped children. Child deaths fell during the pandemic because fewer people driving cars, which is the most dangerous thing for an older child, but 1 to 4 year olds not out in the street. So there were another 80 toddlers like that, right? Not all in Skegness. And it's going up, right? And once it's actually going up, you're not doing the arguments we used to do in the early Blair years of relative gaps, or it's not going down fast enough. Once you've actually got more children dying than the year before because of what you're tolerating, it's almost impossible to defend it. And that's the situation we are currently in.
Yeah. Another thing that I found striking is this thing of empathy or lack thereof, and the data around people kind of suggesting that they are okay with, say, asylum seekers not having access to food or not having access to housing, and people kind of normalizing that scarcity and poverty. And can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, trying to work out how pro-social we are, how many of us do care about other people around us a lot, how many of us actually don't. You know, there's only just me and my family, no such thing as society if they don't try hard enough. There were 2 surveys I looked at, which were both done by YouGov, and both held on exactly the same time period. One was over a few days, the other was longer days. One was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation and found that people are pretty empathetic, apart from those with incomes of over £100,000, right? So, Internet is really interested all the way up to there. Majority of people thought public spending should be increased, other things should be done. But they did a different survey, commissioned, I think, by one of the tabloid right-wing newspapers, which asked the questions, should asylum seekers receive any food at all, that kind of thing. And part of it is by the way in which you ask the questions and trigger people, and whether you call a person or an asylum seeker. But part of it is what is in us. And what is in us can change. We can become more brutal. We can become more stiff, less emotive. We learn to be colder and more cold-hearted, I think, over time. So years ago, over 20 years ago, I did a public talk in Oslo, and I started my public talk. And in Oslo 20 years ago, interestingly, unlike here, there were 3 babies in the audience, because even 20 years ago, it's normal to come out with your baby to hear public talk. And that was a surprise for me. I started the talk by saying, congratulations on having the lowest rate of child poverty in the world, to the audience in Oslo, thinking I was being nice. And I got booed. They said it's too high, shouted out it's too high. How can you say that? It's 10%. It's something we're really embarrassed about, which is why they had the lowest rate of child poverty in the world, because it angered them. Now, you can measure it on our political opinions, and we've become more like people in the USA, which is, we can't ask, the poverty surveys which were developed at Bristol University, where you ask people, should children have 2 pairs of shoes, should they have a warm coat, should teenagers have a mobile phone? You know, we've asked these questions since 1968. There's always a marginal item. The marginal item for pensioners last time was, should they have a bird feeder? And the answer, it's done brilliantly. I love these surveys. They're done with Argos catalogues. You get a group like you around for a whole day, give you a little bit of money, and sit through going, should somebody be able to have that or not? And the marginal item was, pensioners should be able to afford a bird feeder, but if they want to put any grain in it, that should come. They should not buy something else, like food for themselves, if they're going to feed birds. So it's a way in which you measure what people think of as decent in society. And some of us have become much colder, which makes sense. I mean, you know, how would you vote for the economically most right-wing government, according to the FT, in the world, and think that what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were doing was acceptable and this sort of thing, unless you'd actually had some of your soul chipped away. And living and growing up with great inequality makes you a less pro-social human being. Living and growing up in a society of more solidarity, going to the same schools as everybody else, makes you think of other people as like you. You don't think of this set of people, we should be nice to them, we should have charity, but they never quite have it in them to be like me. And you don't think of yourself as, well, I do deserve 2 or 3 times the average income because I'm so special. But in an unequal society, that is inbred into you. You can't send a child to a school which costs 60 or 70,000 pounds a year and easily explain to that child, that 14, 15, 16-year-old child, it isn't because you're so special that you need this spent on you. You know, it's actually just the way society works. You know, it's inbred in you by inequality that people are different. You know, it's partly what my university does, University of Oxford. We've just had the start of term. Our term starts late, thank God, but you know, I think it was last week. On the Monday at the start of term in every college, ordinary undergraduates are brought in. Every master, president, mistress of a college says to them, congratulations to these 18-year-olds. Don't worry. Don't worry. You'll all be worrying. You'll all think you shouldn't be here. But don't worry, because we've ever so carefully selected you. Because you are the creme de la creme. But if you're feeling sad, come to the lodge and have a cup of cocoa with me, and you know, and because they're scared, obviously, of the poor mental health of students. But this message, don't worry because you are so clever, you deserve to be at the University of Oxford. Prince, again at 18, you are special, you're specially talented. And later on, you can look after little people, but we're taking you away from them. Other countries in Europe do not separate their children between schools or at universities anything like we do. And we didn't used to do it as badly. In the 1960s in my university, we were mixing people from different schools in which we'd never done before. That's when they were playing It's All Too Beautiful and so on, and the Beatles records were going, and sex began in 1963. But it was a different time, even in a snobby place like the University of Oxford. I saw it recently because we went through a round of heads of colleges who had all been 1960s graduates. And this is Somerville, you know, the Oxford colleges. The heads of the colleges were more radical than the younger academic staff because they had been 1960s students and believed in certain things. And it's quite odd when a set of people who are older are more progressive than a set of people who are younger. But the younger people were loads of money, 1980s, we've got here for ourselves. And this takes a long time to unravel. It takes generations, about 2 or 3 generations, to go from an utterly divided country like Finland after the terror in 1918, when they were just killing each other, to Finland today. It's 2 or 3 generations to see each other as the same. It can't be done overnight. Ideally, you grow up from birth mixing with other people and not being treated separately and not fearing poverty, but also not being put on a pedestal.
Yeah. So we also are seeing a lot of public opinion polarized around different kind of issues. We've seen opinion polarized in the UK around Brexit and where we are with that. I'm originally from Moldova. We had a referendum on Sunday about joining the European Union, and it was the difference is paper thin between the yes and the no, with only 50. Well, I say only 50.8% 61% saying yes and 49.39 saying no. So opinion is very polarized, and in this polarized environment, how do we bring people together around issues of solving equality and bringing about justice?
My best assumption about it, I mean, we've only got one planet. This is so statistically, if we had 200 planet Earths, each with roughly 200 nation states running separately, we could properly answer these questions at least. But we only have one. We only got one set of history. When the economic divides between people widen, when they perceive that they're not getting the promise from the state that they were, because you can't have a divided society and most people do well. It's impossible. So most people end up feeling badly off. An example: 65% of people now go to university by the age of 30, 2/3 in this country, and we tell them that they're going to be earning more than average. Okay, and it's not possible. And then we tell them if they're not, it's their own fault. And actually, that works quite well for a time. You know, you should just have tried harder. You get anger, you get resentment. Two countries with the biggest rises recorded in inequalities in the 1930s. The two countries with the biggest rises in economic inequality by income in the 1930s were Germany and Japan. Over wage levels. You know, it creates an atmosphere in which you can do very nasty things and people will behave in terrible ways. You have to economically bring people together. The easiest way to do that is what we're currently doing, is actually becoming poorer together, but the rich become poorer faster, because if you don't increase benefits, at least by inflation, you're going to have more dead bodies. And that's essentially what we've been doing, why the state pension has been rising, why the benefits have been rising by inflation last couple of years, more than incomes have, which is greater equality. And that ultimately is what you've got to do. The question is, how do you sell that to people? The country that's done it the most recently is Scotland. So it's not far away. In Scotland, the idea that it is possible not to be like this has been, and when I say sold to the population, and I'll put the credit actually down to 1997 government. One of the most effective things they did was devolution. If you remember, Glasgow used to have the highest poverty rate in Britain. Scotland had the highest poverty rate. Child poverty rate in Scotland is now lower than every region of England, including the southeast, which doesn't include London. There are fewer children poor in Scotland. There is an agreement across Scotland between the Labour Party and the SNP that this is desirable. The Labour Party do not oppose the Scottish child payment. 2 out of 7 children in Scotland, their parents, mothers in almost all cases, receive now about £26.10 a week on top of all other benefits. If you've got a family of 3, that's £4,000 a year extra, not tapered. You don't lose things because of it. So no child in Scotland has to go cold or hungry. You know, if you're asking, what can we do? We're doing it. We're not doing it in some faraway Nordic utopia. You can bring in regulations on landlords so they can't evict people faster than it's happening down here. They can't increase rents. 1 in 3 of our children are in private renting. That was never the desire in the 1980s when we brought in assured short-hold tenancies and ended rent regulations, which most of Europe still has. The desire was young professional students. It wasn't that families would end up private renting. And just think about it for a second. You've got an assured short-hold tenancy, and you're a parent, and your landlord gives you 2 months' notice, and you've got children. So they've got to move schools, lose all their friends. In London, this is several times in their childhood because of the way the rents change. You know, it wasn't, I don't think it was by design, but it's, and what do you do about it? Well, you take away the power of landlords to actually be able to do this. And You might start it with, if you're not, you might start it with if the family contain a child, but then if you do it that, landlords won't let children, which of course already if you've got children, landlords are trying not to house you, partly because they might feel guilty about evicting you with the kids. But it's not exactly hard what you do. And landlords are not going to bulldoze their property because they can't make as much rent as they were making before. They may sell it. Property that's sold, as long as society is becoming more equal, is always used more efficiently, because when you buy somewhere, unless you're very rich, you buy somewhere you can fit in. If you want a symbol of the housing crisis, in the past when I was growing up, council maisonettes would house a mum and a dad and 2 kids. Those council maisonettes now have gone through and are owned by a private landlord in many cases, by a right to buy, and very often house a slightly disgruntled young professional who can't believe that all they can rent is a former council maisonette on a slightly run-down estate with no ball game signs that are fading from the 1980s. But there's one person in that flat now, right? Not 4. And you wonder why we've got a housing crisis. We have more bedrooms per person we've ever had. We have enough housing. But we went for the market as being efficient, to help prove that basic economics 101 is wrong. We did the experiment on it, and it's that sense. Michael Gove speaking out against black mold. Not actually doing that, but at least saying this is intolerable. Cases in the courts of actually saying this is manslaughter when a child dies, or to give her due, the Conservative minister who at the end of the summer and at the end of her tether, I think this was last summer, it's very recent, publicly spoke out and said, these 200 schools have to close because those roofs may fall on the children. Now, there was an internal debate in Westminster on whether to do that. That's why it was towards the start of the school term when suddenly those schools were not allowed to open, and some universities and some libraries. And that's the change you're getting, because before then we were willing to take a risk with people, right? Whereas it becomes seen as intolerable to do that. You can get very depressed about this. You can go, we can't possibly, right, cope. We have more school buildings per head than anywhere else in Europe because we've got a divided education system, right? This city, whatever it is, 20-25% private. Oxford is 30%. Enormous number of teachers inefficiently used, enormous number of buildings and playing fields, enormous numbers of empty houses. We have enormous numbers of doctors and nurses, but we have 1 in 10 people, not just ill, 1 in 10 of all adults using private healthcare now because they have to, but it isn't as efficient. So we're misusing our resources because we've become so unequal. It's not that they're not there. It's just that a few of us are using them more. I'm well into the top 10%. We won't do the income distribution of the room. I always like trying to frighten book festivals by making it appear as if we're going to sort everybody by income during the time. But my group, top 10%, we're taking 40% of everything. We are leaving 60% to the other 90% of society. Nowhere else in Europe does it. We haven't done this since the 30s. Of course we've got a problem. It's not hard to understand this.
That started off as a very optimistic answer to my question and kind of
slowly
went downhill from there. So as my last question before I open it up to the audience, in a few words, are you hopeful?
I am hopeful. I don't think it's my natural nature to be. But no, I am. I've been pleasantly surprised by the current government. I guess I had quite low expectations, as you can tell from the first few chapters in the book. The first chapter, the one I think is titled "Did You Not See Me?" The words of the Deliveroo cyclist after he was hit by Keir Starmer on his car. And so I had low expectations of what Keir and Rachel Reeves would do. They have already moved away from the supposed rules that can't be changed on spending. They're going to change the rules that can't be changed. If you change rules, they're not really rules, but that's okay. Gordon Brown made them up anyway. Within days of the election, an attorney general was appointed who wasn't expected to be appointed if you're watching these things. And suddenly 10% of our weapons that we were exporting can't be. Don't have to get into that, although you can't write a book called Peak Injustice and not mention something going on in the world which is rather large. We're now talking of raising 40 billion in the budget rather than 20 billion. We're talking about getting rid of the loopholes where you can create a trust and avoid inheritance tax for your families within a few weeks. We're not yet talking about when we're going to do the very basic things on the benefit cap and the money for the third child. I would hope they would at least think of hinting at promising that that will occur within 12 months or 18 months. I mean, it should be immediate, but if you can't even say it is our intention that will be very bad news in the budget. But I'm most of all hopeful because I no longer see those kind of Tufton Street people making their arguments and them being taken seriously anywhere. I know they haven't gone away, but they're not being reported anymore. And of course, you know, reform is frightening if you're from my side of politics. But I don't see confident right-wingers anymore, you know, apart from Liz Truss, and then led by donkeys goes and puts something down and she huffs off stage. You know, she can't even stand there and, you know, it. And then you've got the Conservatives attacking Kemi because she can't turn up on time to meetings. I mean, it's like infighting amongst the cheerleaders of neoliberalism are all attacking each other right now. That doesn't mean things are going to be okay. They could get their act together. The people with money who back them, you know, could say, stop this, whatever you're doing. You don't fight in front of the little people. You know, that's not how it is done. We've got the UK out of the EU. Why are you making a mess of it? The hedge fund people who bankroll Farage, you know, they're in disarray at the moment too, and they could easily get their act together and say, you know, we paid for this country. We paid for the Conservative Party. We paid at times for Labour. We paid to get Brexit and we got it. It's a big investment to lose. You know, so I could be negative, but there's no sign of them managing to do that at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. Now the moment you will be waiting for. Let's fire some questions from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, so my family are Danish, and I look at my Danish relatives, and I see that society is fairly equal and flat. And they have a flat hierarchy. They have high levels of trust.
Yeah.
They pay a large amount in taxes. They have a law that's a sort of societal code of conduct for the Danes called the Antas law, which specifically says you are not to think of yourself as being any better than anybody else. Yeah. And I can see how all of these things contribute to a far more equal society in Denmark. But there's one thing that they don't have, that we have, that screams to me that causes most of our problems, which is the class system.
Yeah. So
I wondered if you could speak a bit about how do we deal with that?
How do we cope with the class system? If you go back 100 years, all countries in Europe had a class system and an aristocracy, 1% who are taking 20-25% of everything, and servants. Denmark was a little bit poorer, so not as obvious. Finland was really poor. But, you know, our class system is not unique. However, we became the richest country on earth, largest empire ever. I won't talk about why is Bristol here, right? And if you become the richest empire on earth, and you only do it by having a class hierarchy system, you know, if you're going to control a country with just 20 men with guns, you've got to have an officer willing to sacrifice them. you've got to have a set of schools that dehumanize people, take them away from their homes, teach them how to use rifles, which the Jam sang about over. So we have an educational system and a university system designed to run an empire and create people as brutal as the Romans were brutal. It does go away eventually. It's hard to maintain a class system. You can see the signs of it going away. If you remember David Cameron and Nick Clegg, when they stood together in the Rose Garden, no tie, button one up from mine, but still unbuttoned top button. Cufflinks, because they hadn't been told, the cufflinks have to come off as well. but the call me Dave, call me Nick, that's the beginning of a realization that this is not a good look anymore. One way you get rid of a class system is the academic doldrums that we're in. So you could take a school in Bristol that may have been private at one point, but there's a banking crash in 2008 and it academizes itself. That's the polite way to do it. Or my favourite thing that happened last year, the Secretary of State for Education, Conservative, sent a letter to every further education college on one day telling them that you're now part of my department because the Office of National Statistics has reclassified you, further education, as public sector spending, not private. They nationalised FE in a day. And the letter was, you may no longer borrow any money because you're part of the Department for Education. The implicit thing was, and you cannot pay yourself more than the Prime Minister as the head of an FE college. And that begins to get rid of the class system because that FE college head can no longer send their child to Abingdon Public School on the salary that they're getting. You can't divide yourselves between people as much. So class systems can be dissolved and can reduce dramatically. The fastest way to get rid of a class system is lose a war. And, you could say it's unfortunate that we haven't lost a war, which is why the same people own Devon that were given Devon in 1066. We had a very subtle, glorious revolution where somebody else took us over, but we pretend that never happened. When you lose a war, those people currently who were in charge are removed. They failed apart from anything else, and a new set of people come in. My favourite example of a class system being destroyed is what the Americans did in Japan after 1945, when they took the land off the aristocracy and redistributed it as equally as they could because they were scared there'd be a revolution in Japan after the war. They only left the emperor. The rest of the aristocracy went. And they created a 90% single social class society for a time. And that's imposed, but and which then had the most incredible economic growth and rose to have the highest life expectancy on the planet from having had low life expectancy in the 30s, despite healthy diets. I can find signs that we're seeing it now. My university, we touch on now 70% state school entry. Our students are on average less posh than the students who go to Oxford Brookes, what was Oxford Polytechnic. It's some effort. Bristol, Durham and Exeter are now more posh in terms of intake than Oxford and Cambridge. But at the same time, the majority of students in my university are postgraduate students. The majority of them are paying very high fees, and they're from the world 0.01%. So if you know your class systems, it's like we're still Brideshead Revisited, but Sebastian is now called Zeb and comes from Silicon Valley. But we're trying to work our way through this. So internally, for the English, much more in Scotland. In Scotland, if you're Scottish and local and normal, is what they should say, it's a grade entry lower to Scottish universities like St Andrews. So absolute positive discrimination going on in Scotland to reduce class divides. Universities, what we do is sell class. We call it education, and there is a bit of it, but essentially, I'm being a bit flippant, but you get your child into a certain university, and you have either maintained them within your class, or you have elevated them potentially above it. And then they might marry well, which of course is how you secure the class positions. Or the worst thing that can happen is your child marries somebody below. And you've spent all this effort getting to this point, which is why you pay so they don't go to a school with those children that they might meet. Right? And it's our educational system is designed to maintain a class system and hopes and aspirations, doing well for yourself, bettering yourself, all those things. It's easy for me to be flippant about it, right? But these aspirations really matter to people. The fear of falling is absolutely enormous, which is why we have the lowest social mobility in Europe. Because we, those of us in the top 10%, do whatever we can, even if it's just to keep our children in the top 10%. Because otherwise they're not going to be getting 40% of all income. And in a country that's relatively poor, 40% of all income doesn't feel like that much when we look at the Americans or the Dutch, let alone people coming from China to shop in Bicester Village. Yeah.
I mean, I can relate to that question. I'm a governor, a careers governor at a secondary school, and when I talk to other career governors and say Hartcliffe, it's all about apprenticeships. That's the extent of the career conversations. And then you go to a school in Redland or in Clifton, and it's all about university degrees. And the difference is stark. It really is when you talk to those career advisors.
The equivalent school to the one in Hartcliffe, which is a bit of research. When I was here, I went to that school. I think the one you're talking about. The school we have in Oxford, we have a school which is in the bottom 20 in the country, which you might think is amazing. How on earth can Oxford end up with that? But that's segregation for you. On the walls of that school, the adverts are for the boys to get an apprenticeship learning how to fix bicycles. Because university students don't fix their own bicycles anymore, but it's a lucrative. And for the girls, the 15, 16-year-old girls in the school in Oxford, an apprenticeship to learn to be a beauty therapist, but in particular a masseur, right? And this is a government flagship early academy in a poor area. Your future is an apprenticeship, and if you're female, it's a masseur, and if you're male, it's a bike. When I went to school, not the same school, but in the same city, it was very sexist, but almost all the boys at 15 went into the car factory for a job that paid an horrible job, incredibly good salary, double what a servant got, and the women were taught to cook and sew. Incredibly sexist. But if I had to choose between being taught to cook and sew or being taught to massage somebody, I'd prefer cooking and sewing.
So nobody asked for a massage from Danny today.
No.
I see a question at the back, the very back.
Danny, has the government denied itself the best opportunities for redistribution by saying they won't raise income tax in particular?
They've denied themselves the easiest one, and other countries in Europe simply have higher rates of income tax at the top rate. It does at least make them focus their minds on every other single possibility. Employers, national insurance, but those aren't necessarily good. You don't really want to be taxing employment. It is focusing their minds, I think, unwittingly on wealth. And they could make a case, as we did in 1918, that this is an emergency. It wouldn't be hard to make a case for an emergency. And at least to do a temporary wealth tax, what the patriotic millionaires are calling for, particularly affecting people whose wealth is over 10 million, but over 2. And that raises some money, at least in the short term. Lots of studies about who would run away. People don't tend to flee. We suspect they really don't tend to flee London, which is where most of the very wealthy are. And if the government were really brave, they could actually somebody could stand up and say, if you're really going to leave Britain because we're going to ask you to contribute in this emergency, we'd rather not have you here, with 2 Union Jacks behind them. Anyway, to do that. But yes, it's a mistake, I think, not to at least think of raising the top rate to what it is in Scotland, if that's a possibility. My preference is to have it very tiered, so that once you're over 200, 300, 400, you're paying a lot more. You know what the Beatles used to sing about and how they hated because they were paying 97%. Didn't mean they didn't produce good music. You know, you can anyway. And I call it the Jeremy Clarkson tax. She'll sue me one day. So the Jeremy Clarkson tax is where over a certain income, you are on the marginal rates after the first million you've earned, say, I don't know if it's, you're paying near to 100%. And all that means is that if you really want to fly to Australia and drive a car through the outback and be filmed making slightly bad jokes with your friends, you can still do that. It's just that all the money that the BBC are going to give you, or whoever now pays for them, is going to go to the exchequer and make life better for other people. So, if you are Jeremy Clarkson, you'll only do it if you really want to do it, not because you feel you need more money. You know, it actually increases the freedom of very well-off people. It helps. It helps them cope with their addiction to greed and money. It's beneficial, and it's partly. And when people are polled in countries with these quite high tax rates, they do say people in countries with higher tax rates are more in favour of paying tax. People in countries like us with one of the lowest tax rates, despite it being the highest for 70 years, it's still the lowest in Europe, apart from Ireland and Switzerland, because of GDP strange things. We see tax as theft because of the way our societies are. It's possible, not theoretically, it actually happens in other places where this is seen as something that makes your life good, that you do it. You can live in there, you don't worry about crime. You don't worry about homelessness because you don't see it because there isn't any in somewhere like Finland. You don't worry that your salary as a university professor is much lower than it would be here in Bristol because, of course, your children are going to walk to the nearest school. You'd never think of trying to find one of the tiny number of private schools in Finland to send them to. That would just be madness, right? You're not going to need to wall yourself away from other people. That's not going to make you happy. And this really happens in other places. It's not me saying, wouldn't it be lovely? You know, one thing that makes it easier to make some of these arguments, at least for me, is that we are in this position and there are these other countries doing better. They're not utopias, and often people get quite annoyed and they want to say, you know, don't you know how terrible it is in France and so on? And you go, yeah, but you are living longer. And your median family is so much better off, and you know, not just it's kind of like nice weather and so on. It's not all. There are things that Britain is good at. Not being racist, we're actually quite good at. But again, that's our history of having had such a large empire. We've had people from abroad and other places.
Let's take a question from there.
Danny, I'm really interested in your ideas about the potential unintended consequences of doing policies which reduce injustice or inequality. In particular, at the moment, we've got a lot of employment laws coming through which are much more pro-worker, higher taxes on national insurance. Do you think there's a chance they might potentially alienate some people from the employment market because employers are less likely to take a risk on someone that has higher employment rights? Or the cost of employing someone's higher to the point where they don't include people from lower income backgrounds into the workforce?
I think you've got to base it on what actually happens when these things are implemented. The classic is minimum wage. If you remember, all the arguments against having a minimum wage was that this would reduce number of jobs, you wouldn't get people. Actually turned out that had no effect. We have a high rate of illness, So lots of people are not working because they're ill. But once you take out the people who are ill, we have a really high rate of employment. But that's partly because you have to work, because we have the lowest benefits. So you can barely live off the money you would get. And of course, you'll be sanctioned if you don't apply for 30 jobs every 2 weeks, whatever. Or you need to have 2 jobs or 3 jobs. So in my city, and it may well be the case here, if you go to a pub tonight, it could well be a primary school teacher who serves you beer. Because if the primary school teacher wants to live in Bristol, rather than miles away, it's higher rent. But if they just work a few nights at night in a pub, as well as full-time as a primary school teacher, they can do it. This causes problems in my city because the students want to work in the pubs. But the problem is the primary school teachers are slightly better and more reliable than the student. And you can end up with too much employment and too cheap labour. So a very, very high rate of employment. And you say it's great that everybody's working, but this doesn't actually make a country productive. We're not doing things primarily which bring money in from abroad. And primarily what we need is money in from abroad, because there are things from abroad that we can't produce. We can't produce enough food for ourselves. There's a whole lot of things we can't make, including steel anymore. We're the only G7 country that we melt it, we don't forge it. And our particular form, with our very lax employment laws, hasn't resulted in a kind of productivity that means we produce things that other people want to buy. Our biggest growth industry for export earnings is overseas students. I worked for 10 years in Sheffield. The 2 universities in Sheffield, I think we had 60,000 overseas students. That brought in more money in terms of export earnings, which is their fees, but also the average spending of £5,000 by a family flying in for graduation from Malaysia, just the hotels. It sounds ridiculous. It was £250 million a year to South Yorkshire. And £250 million export earnings a year for South Yorkshire was bigger than what's officially called the metal industry of South Yorkshire. And before you think, oh, there's no metal industry left, that's the arms industry. That's Rolls-Royce. That we still make a lot of weapons in South Yorkshire, but we can make more money with students. But then you've got to think, what is it that is going to sustain that? And it isn't universities going, oh, they're coming, it's great. You've got to provide something worth coming for. And that's my worry. It's the quality of what people do, and people do a better job when they're happier, not when they're working because they have to work. So we have a lot of very low paid jobs, and we don't have that many in the middle, and then we have a few people making a lot of money at the top, and it isn't an efficient system. But I'm trying not to be theoretical about it. It's look at what happens, particularly across Europe, in places with much tougher employment laws than us, ones which are much more beneficial to workers. Is life worse there than it is here? And if life is better there, measured in simple ways, are their children still getting taller? What kind of home can you live in? If they've got better employment laws that protect workers than we have, and life is better there, it's quite hard to argue that it'll cause us problems. But this is currently in debate. So this is what there are 17 bills being introduced in the first 100 days. One of them is going to be about employment law, but it's still being argued exactly what it's going to be. So it could be watered down from what's promised.
There's a question at the very back.
One of the things I don't think we've touched on yet is, in terms of injustice, is intergenerational injustice.
Yeah.
And by implication, climate injustice.
Yeah.
Would you care to have any thoughts on whether we are at peak injustice?
I could get into trouble here. I get in trouble in lots of ways. We are saying, if you take extinctions, so not climate, but the actual biodiversity and that thing, we're well under peak now, but only because, which sounds strange, peak extinctions were about 20 years ago, by which point 70% of large animals have become extinct. So we've done so much damage so quickly, part of before we really realised it, partly because there are so many rarer animals, that some environmental things have got better, but it's very hard to talk about that. If it hadn't, we'd now be at 100%, which would include us. So it's kind of, it had to happen. The intergenerational climate, we still have just more carbon atoms up there from our coal in this country historically than anyone else. So there is a reparations issue about climate, as well as the generational issue. I'm in an ahhing over this, in that for a long time we didn't know. I'm the last generation of people who took a geography A level, who, to get a high mark, I had to talk about the Ice Age coming. I was taught that at school. It was believed. So although there were a few people with foresight, it really wasn't until the 90s. And then it wasn't until 15 years ago when we got hot summer after hot summer after hot summer worldwide. And if you know that red to blue chart, and suddenly it just all goes red at the end. So you can see where I am on this. It's terrible, but I don't think it was as foreseeable as some people argue. What we need, or one thing we need intergenerationally, is a rapid change to our societies, and including over income distribution, because the carbon pollution of the richest 1% is unbelievable. The things you do when you've got spare money almost all seem to involve incredible expenditure. Private airplanes, you can do much better. Like across Europe, you can have €9 a month or €20 a month tickets. Most people, both business people in Germany, fly. You can ban private aircraft, which is happening in quite a lot of Europe. But you need to have a solidarity society that says it's okay to do these kind of things. We should be designing cities that don't require the car. But you have to believe in planning. And, we destroyed our planning departments to sort of head towards the Midwest system. So we're not planning at the moment to build new housing that doesn't rely on cars. And for it not to rely on cars, it needs to be very near the middle of cities or on the edge. My favourite example, last time I mentioned it, is my home city. Only 150, 160,000 people, it's tiny. We have Greenbelt within a mile of the centre. Could all be new town housing. No cars, electric bikes, buses, public transport. But no, they're thinking of building, and the current new town commission under this government, let's build another car-dependent settlement in the southeast. So, I wouldn't blame it entirely on the generations and the boomers being too selfish, but we do need a very rapid change, and it involves greater equality as well. Thomas Piketty, his book, which came out last month, Nature, Something and Inequality, is unbelievably brilliant on this, partly because it's the shortest book he's ever written. Having written the largest book ever. But if you want Piketty's argument about economics and climate, I've never seen anything put it so clearly and succinctly as he's done. So you don't have to get a big red thick book from me about how terrible. It's the nicest book I've seen about a set of solutions put forward very plainly by a mainstream world economist who happens to come from the most equal of the large 4 European countries, from France.
What we're going to do now is maybe let's take 2 last questions. We'll take them together, have Danny answer them, then we'll conclude the kind of the Q&A, and then I believe there's some books that can be purchased, and maybe Danny will be kind enough to sign a few, or you have already signed a few, whichever way works best. So let's take the last two questions. We've had this hand up here a while.
Thank you. You said a couple of things about places, which I've just sort of play back to you. So scaredness, as soon as people realised that was, that was where it was, everyone forgot about it. Swansea, the local MP could learn more by spending time there.
Yeah.
And what the comments like that point to me is just like the cultural and economic dominance that London has, which is also very unequal to the rest of us. And I suppose my question is, to what extent do you see it being important that places, I'm not talking about devolution here or Devo deals or anything like that, but just places have the levers to put things in train that they know that their communities need, whether that be tax raising, whether it be investing in transport so that people can get to work, whether it be skills. How important is that?
Okay.
So let's take that one and one from here, so we can look at this side.
Well, I was just going to ask if intelligence was a factor in the problems that this country has in reaching the bottom of just about everything. In our education system, people going to the best schools don't get there through achievement, it's through privilege. And that doesn't really happen in the rest of Europe. And I wonder if that plays a part.
Yeah. Okay. Let me do that. Two very different ones.
Places and education.
Places and privilege. On and intelligence. Yes. I'll do places first on that. And you're kind. You didn't mention that. I mentioned Hartcliffe as well. So I did the things my geography colleagues would criticise me for doing, of I stigmatised places by labelling them. Yeah. Back to the heady days of the 70s. We might all have different ideas, but I was there. They've been demonised by conservative historians, and the conservatives hated the 70s because they lost their wealth with inflation. Wages went up as much as inflation, sometimes more, which is partly why it was such a period. Sheffield, where I lived, had higher life expectancy than the English average in the 70s. Right? Sheffield, it's a more healthy city than the average, despite the furnaces, despite the work that people were doing. Hartcliffe, back in the 60s and 70s, was not what it is now, despite the fact that they gave cigarettes as part of the Wills family, I think, as part of your wages. So, of course, that has an effect, but jobs in a factory jobs paid highly, the 1% only getting twice the average earnings, the highest paid person in the city being doctors, not bankers, and somebody's got to be highest paid. Most people having a holiday in the past, whereas we're heading towards 40% of children have no summer holiday now. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was different. It's only Russia, Turkey, and us that have these absolutely dominant cities and these huge geographical inequalities. It used to be Germany before reunification that had the biggest inequality, and Germany's done more to reduce it. It's interesting, it's not quite enough. There's only small parts of Germany that are voting for Alternative for Deutschland to do it. Scotland's devolution has shown the power of true, not saying this is your problem now, here are all the budgets, when there's nothing you can do, which is part of what's going on in England. But truly allowing tax raising and doing other things can help. What we do with London is really difficult. This is kind of like the relic capital of an empire. Moscow is the relic capital of an empire, the USSR. Istanbul is the relic capital of the Ottoman Empire. And these things are strangely sized for odd reasons. We did a project for government years ago about what predicted whether a town does well or badly, and put in loads of variables. And the answer was how long it takes a train leaving that town at 9 o'clock in the morning to get to London. And that predicted economic success. Like I remember Hastings did slightly worse because you had to change. And it was just ridiculous. It's that dominant, the position of London. And it's affected by our class system because what you do, you go to university, you go to an elite university, and at 21 you go to London. And we have this system. And we're going to have to work out how to deal with it. We can look at places that were rich before us. The United Provinces were, the Netherlands, and how the Netherlands now has a much more equal structure of cities and deals with things. We can, but it's not easy. You can't go that much back to find other examples. Losing a war, having a federal structure imposed upon you, as in the case of Germany, is very efficient. But it can't be run from London anymore. It makes no sense. And you can't get civil servants anyway. Top spads in government departments are the person in their early 20s who's got a free bedroom because mum and dad live in Camden. I did a talk to over 100 civil servants in the Cabinet Office and the Treasury at one point in a day before the budget. And I asked them to put up their hands who was renting and who had a mortgage. And 3/4 of them were renting in the Cabinet Office and the Treasury. And as a bad joke, I said to them, only 1/4 of people in this room have got a mortgage or own. And the 3/4 of you are young and fit. If you're willing to jump on that 1/4 who've got property, we can tie them up. We can rewrite the budget. But that was a ridiculous state. The things that have got to. What I would do, I've proposed it once and got poo-pooed. I would move Parliament out of London as a significant thing. The question is where. My suggestion, when it was still going, which shows we're falling down, was the intersection of the Y of HS2, which is just east of Birmingham. You put it directly above the intersection, what was going to be the intersection, because it's only 30 minutes to London from Parliament. That whole area to east of Birmingham had enough space for Whitehall. That terrible building that's a fire hazard called the Palace of Westminster, you sell to whichever entrepreneur wants the 7-star hotel, and they can deal with it. It's ridiculous. It's unlikely, but it's a fast thing to show you're serious to do that. Intelligence. You're going to give it. It's farcical what we have put up with and gone through. 3 changes in prime minister with no election. Bulgaria, our favourite comparator nation, the only one that's almost as equal as we are, had a similar number of changes, but they at least had an election every time, and we didn't. But the idea is that Rishi is ever so clever because he went to Lincoln from Westminster, Lincoln College, Oxford. Truss must be genius because she went to Merton College, Oxford, despite the terrible Roundhay school she went to in Leeds, which is where my mum went, the poshest state school in Leeds. Johnson, Balliol, must be a genius. Cameron, Brasenose. Go through Blair, St John's. Occasionally we let a deputy prime minister come from Cambridge, that's Nick Clegg. But geez, and all these people have done is a 3-year degree. A 3-year degree. And sat for an hour a week reading out an essay. Right? What on earth were we playing at? Except for Matt Hancock. Because Matt, I'd love you to know this, Matt has got a master's in economics from Cambridge. So he's a genius. And he actually, sorry, I shouldn't be irrelevant, but if you've worked your whole life in universities, like the degree is a little bit you do at the first, and yes, it's very interesting. Apologies to my son who's just starting one. Right, there we go.
Very important.
Very important. The degree is very important, but you do not become an absolute kind of expert on something because you spent 3 years studying it at university, or masters. You don't ever really, but and it is. Could we find a better set of people? Is it next question?
It was really
Yeah.
the schools that they went to before university that I was thinking of.
The ones that they paid in to go.
Yes. And then getting into university because they
Yeah.
had those schools.
I mean, what their schools can do, and it's interesting. You can't get to B in geography from Eton; it's not possible. Outside the geography house in Eton, there's a board which shows how many got A stars, how many got A's. Nobody gets a B. Mill Hill has 10 geography teachers. This gets you an A. You know, you can take almost any child and get them 3 A's. It's meaningless. We've published a paper here based on the child of the 90s, the Avon study. You know, they got all the placentas of the kids born in. Yep. So the most studied children are from here. And Tim Morris did this, not my credit, George W. Smith and me. We looked at all the children in the 90s. We looked at them tested for ability at age 8. And I can do a very left-wing thing of I couldn't read at age 8. I would have failed this, and I'm all right. But anyway, they've all been tested this whole year's worth of birth in Avon. And the children of Bristol mainly, who were in the bottom half, but the top half, quartile 2, so slower than average. If they were sent to a private school in Bristol, they were much more likely to get 3 A's than the most promising quarter of children by an intelligence test at age 8 who went to Bristol state schools. A levels are just largely bought. They are largely a function of the money your parents have and your school. And then a little bit of work by you and how nerdy you might be and other things, or a teacher taking an interest, picking the right subjects, not being ill at the wrong time to do that. But the sad thing about our system is that when we test people, for instance, in mathematics, and you'll be glad I'm winding up, so I won't. This is my other way I try and give fear to audiences. I ask you, let's go. We've probably got some O levels, but we won't go back to, who got an A in maths at O level, who got an 8 or 9 at GCSE. Okay, in a standard audience, what on earth are you doing here rather than clubbing? Right, it tends to be fairly high. And then we just put up a question from the paper you would have taken in your year. And this has been done across Europe. And it turns out that if we test people at mathematics at age 24, we are the worst at it. Because we have been taught to get an A or an A star if we're posh, or absolutely essential a C in my old language, a 5 if you're young. Because otherwise, if you take something like the emergency services without a C in maths, you can't go to nursing, you can't go into the police force, you've got to be a firefighter. It's mean, that's our class system. Firefighting is the thing you're allowed to do if you don't get a C in English and maths. So all our schools teach the test, but particularly the elite private schools, which means we don't actually know things. We don't know them, unless you actually enjoyed it, and taught yourself and carried on teaching yourself. And the staggering difference across the continent. The easiest one is language. How many languages do people speak? How much do we encourage people to learn languages? But the fact that the countries in which people know the most languages are also the ones where they do best when we test them at mathematics and problem solving, is worrying. So we have to get our way out of this. We have done something to our education system that has damaged it from the very, very top all the way through. And we say things like, we have the best schools in the world. And we certainly do charge some of the highest fees. And we have families flying in to our boarding schools. Thankfully, things are changing. English upper class do not send their children to boarding schools anymore. They just know. It takes enough decades of, it's the same stories, you don't. But we're filling our boarding schools with young people from abroad. Similarly with our universities. You know, we have the best universities in the world. My university ranks #1 according to the ranking done in London, 9 years in a row. What we don't do is allow anybody to do a test of our undergraduates and compare the actual ability of our undergraduates at, say, age 22 or 23 with undergraduates coming from an average, middle-of-the-range European university. That can't be allowed. It's like testing, you know, an Adidas trainer to actually see, is it much, much better than another trainer for the purposes of running, right? And that's, when you're selling a brand, you know, you're not allowed, and could be sued for it. And we've got into this way of doing things, and we have to find a way out of it. We have to find a way of being more inclusive. We can't carry on selling a story that we're all about excellence in a country that is sinking down and down the ranks in so many things at the same time. It becomes farcical in the end.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny, so much for your time here today. One final thing in one sentence. What can we all do tomorrow?
What can we all do? Talking to people about uncomfortable things. You know, when you're thinking of not saying something, don't make people feel sad or whatever, but do talk to people about things which are uncomfortable, because that is the change that happened last time. John Maynard Keynes had a best friend called Folks. What's his surname? And Folks was a banker, and he wasn't very nice. But what Folks said to Keynes is that what's really going on, this is in Bloomsbury in the 30s, at a time when a eugenicist called Beveridge was changing his views, a misogynist eugenicist, elitist Beveridge was changing his views. And he said the moral sentiment's changing. The actual, what people think of as right was changing in elite society amongst the upper middle class and the upper class. What was seen as decent was changing in the 1930s. Now, it was partly because some of these men, largely men, had fought in the First World War. So they had slightly different memories and experiences than their fathers had had. But there was also a sense by the 1930s that this wasn't working, that maybe the story of the wonderful empire wasn't so great. And once their fathers and their grandfathers took us to a war for a second time, which could have been avoided, of course the First World War could have been, but there was a realization that the Second World War probably could have been avoided, and they had to go and fight. When they came back and during the war, across the board, if you read Hansard in 1945, it wasn't just Labour. Across the board, there was a generational wish for something utterly different. Hence the NHS, hence the world's most impressive social housing programme. Majority of children in the late 40s grew up in a council house at some point. Not special, you're normal if you grew up in a council house in the 40s. Later on, we changed our education system and then changed it to the most equal in the world in the 1960s, which people from Finland come and copy and implement when they get rid of the grammar school divide in Finland, but do it properly and end up with the best results. I mean, we were world leading in health. We had the lowest infant mortality in the world by a tiny number of small countries. I was born in 1968 in the best place to be born, with the very earliest baby incubators. You know, the best place, the best housing and the best education systems. World leading, not because of our natural ability, you know, and our genes and so on, which you got to remember that at the time that Darwin was speaking, we had this empire, so we told ourselves that we were at the top of the world because the origin of species and whatever the rest of the word was, the preservation of favoured races, if you know the full title. You know, you could speak it. We did such a good job for the 1930s onwards because we did have wealth, we did have an empire, we were much richer than the rest of Europe, we could redistribute. It could be made a much better country for the working class, but we did it. And it could be done again, because there is still enormous wealth here in the country, and the rich are not happy, right? But very, very frightened, but not particularly happy. The highest use of antidepressants that we've ever seen reported is in Beverly Hills, where people even put their dogs on selective. Yeah, so it isn't as if inequality makes people at the top happy. So it shouldn't be that hard, but you become frightened, you get into a rut, you talk about rewards, and you get really frightened of losing the thing you've got. I'll just end because it gives you a clue to the start of the book. We were talking earlier about The Guardian. Imagine you're sort of relatively high up in the Guardian newspaper, and it's 2017, 2018. And there's a manifesto that comes out in 2017 that essentially says we are going to increase public spending to the level of Germany in 5 years. It should have said that. It would sound much more plausible than what the 2017-led manifesto said. And then you're approaching 2019, and there's roughly the same thing in place. What does that actually mean for you? You're one of the better off people in the Guardian. You're living in that part of London. You may have got your kid into Camden School for Girls, but they might well be in North London Collegiate, because you are part of 20-25% that's using private education in London. If your taxes are increased, you may have to move your child from the school that may well guarantee their place at the college that might be the one that you went to, which is partly why you're at the Guardian, where everybody else has been to a college in Oxford and occasionally Cambridge, but not as much. It's scary. It's really, really frightening to think you're going to go down because of some experiment by some utopian man with a beard and his weird friends. You know, it's really scary. You've worked hard for that second home in France. You know, I want to try and work out a sympathy for the rich. Your children aren't that special, and you know it. So if they don't get that extra help, they will find it hard. And you've heard what goes on in those other schools in London. And you don't like the idea of drugs. And you don't know that drug use is highest in private schools, because of course it is, because that's who's got the money. But you're scared. You're scared. And so what do you do at the top of the Guardian? You go for the leader of the Labour Party, and you essentially tell people, you might as well go for Boris. And I have it in the book. The behaviour of the Guardian newspaper in 2018, 2019, I think epitomises our problem as a country. Because if the Guardian is against that kind of change, then you really do have a problem. Luckily, we now have the Financial Times, who is actually to the left of the Guardian, because it has to sell papers in Europe, and is saying we need. And who would have believed it? That the Financial Times would be the paper saying this has gone too far and it has to change, and not the Guardian. So there's hope, things change, you can't predict it, but I honestly don't think we can. It's really, really hard. It takes a lot of work to maintain a position as the most unequal country on a continent. When you're a large country, it takes malevolence, it takes think tanks, it takes shady figures. Yeah, it takes Liz Truss and people willing to put Liz Truss forward. I mean, what were they thinking? The thing, although to be kind to Liz, true story, because you know statues are really important. Yeah. There is on an island in the Cherwell River, owned by Merton College, a beautifully sculptured lettuce, which has been placed there by some benefactors to celebrate Liz Truss's wonderful 49 days. There's another lettuce in the garden of Merton College, another one in the junior common room. There are various lettuces sprouting up. This is completely true, isn't it? Yeah. No. The ultimate, not the speed. The ultimate aim of the memorials to Liz is that one day we should have a statue on the high street of my city to her, and it should go on the highest plinth on the high street, and we just have to take somebody down called Cecil Rhodes and put up Liz Truss, because statues are really important and we have to remember our history and what happened. So yeah. So if you want to support me on, and I know you have a thing about statues, so we're very near, aren't we? Just there. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of river that near in Bristol. We don't have a nice set of anarchists in Bristol, so in Oxford. But I don't know. It's sarcastic and so on. But saying no, let's talk about what you actually did, and let's talk about what kind of statue would you like to remember what you did. And okay, a bit of humour, but also come on, grow up. And what quite right-wing posh people who run the Spectator, for instance, or did, really want to be seen as is clever. They hate being seen as stupid. And you can use that to say, oh, come on. And that's what happened 100 years ago. People at the top of society, people at the very top of society, who are extremely rich, enough of them changed their views. It wasn't just revolution from the below and trade unions that helped. It was people like Tawney and Beveridge and Keynes actually changing their views about the worth and value of other human beings. And that's what we've got to do again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.